In Essential Task 4.8, we are going to contrast what we talked about in 4.7 with Freud with individuals who were, in some cases, contemporaries who partially agreed with Freud but would not entirely embrace all of Freud's work. We call these individuals neo-Freudians. I think horizontal or vertical honestly works for this. It's only the three boxes that you see. I will say some of them are a little tall. There are some pictures that make it look taller than they actually are, but I think you could hold this horizontal or vertically without much difficulty. I will return, though, to the text of the task and allow you to pause the video before transitioning into the concept map. So again, we're going to call these individuals neo-Freudians, meaning these are going to be people who generally agree with Freud, specifically when he talked about the unconscious and the structures of the id, the ego, and the superego. But, and this is a big but individuals who would not fully embrace Freud's emphasis on libido or sex drive. As we talked about, one of the huge aspects of Freud's work was his constant emphasis on the sex drive, as exemplified by the id's urges. Also, additionally, the psychosexual stages of development. Neo-Freudians, by and large, agreed with the structures, the id, the superego, and the ego, but would not fully embrace Freud on that front, and therefore classified themselves as neo-Freudian, offering up their own extensions of Freud's work without accepting the entirety of Freud's work. So you could still see these individuals called psychoanalysts or psychoanalysts. Some people, again, kind of reference the term psychodynamic when talking about this. But at the end of the day, people who partially, but not entirely, agreed with Freud's work. There are a few people that would classify as neo-Freudians. We're going to highlight two of them, though. We're going to talk about Alfred Adler and Carl Jung. So again, we're going to emphasize that the unconscious conflicts that exist do not, at least according to the individuals that we talk about today, do not have that overwhelming sexual aspect like Freud talked about. First individual who offers sort of his own interpretation of what might occur on an unconscious level that could therefore affect personality and behavior is Alfred Adler's inferiority complex. I'm going to give him a small letter C, not overwhelmingly important, but nevertheless a psychologist we still referenced. Adler believed that our personality was a reflection of unconscious conflicts, but specifically the unconscious conflict of having to overcome feelings of inferiority, especially feelings of inferiority when we're young. It's really important to put this into context. When you're young, when you're going into first grade, second grade, third grade, it becomes pretty obvious very quickly that you're not the greatest thing on earth. Certainly your parents might have treated you like that. You're the cutest baby, the greatest baby ever, the best kid ever. And then you realize you go to middle school, you go to first grade, second grade, third grade, and so on. And somebody's better at you at sports. Somebody's more artistic than you. Somebody's better at music. You might have one strength. Maybe you're the best in the class at math, but you're certainly not the best across the board. People are better at you at basically everything that you touch. And you have to kind of come to the realization that maybe I'm not as superior as I may have thought, or perhaps as my parents bestowed on me. You have to kind of acknowledge the fact that you're not likely going to be the best at everything. You might not even be the best at one thing within your peer group. Overcoming that inferiority is a really challenging unconscious conflict, at least in the eyes of Adler. And some people don't overcome that effectively. Again, at least in the eyes of Adler. This is a quote right from his writing. To be a human being means to feel oneself inferior. The child comes into this world as a helpless little creature surrounded by powerful adults. It's healthy to overcome this inferiority, whether that's, again, realizing that at a very, very young age, you're entirely dependent on your parents and guardians, but even as you age and grow into school ages, overcoming that feeling of inferiority and not having that be sort of an unhealthy byproduct of not overcoming the inferiority complex as a child. Because if you have this sort of lingering inferiority, it could creep up when you're trying to get a job, when you're applying for colleges. And if you don't overcome that effectively, it can really have a detrimental impact on your personality and behavior as an adult. The mnemonic here is a little silly. It requires you to enjoy looking at this picture here with the two deer with different sized antlers. I kind of like to visualize this as a reflection of the inferiority complex, where the one on the right comes to realize that his antlers aren't the greatest, not nearly the greatest, and that hopefully for his sake, that doesn't linger on throughout his life and that he can overcome this feeling of inferiority and realize that it's more or less a natural element of human behavior, or I guess animal behavior. Again, silly little mnemonic. The word Adler kind of looks like the word antlers, at least to me, And I always picture this visual. The other Neo-Freudian and the last individual is Carl Jung. He gets a small letter C. He's actually a pretty well-known individual, but on the AP exam, he's not referenced all that much. So we'll give him the small letter C, acknowledging, though, that you may have actually heard of him in other contexts. Jung offered what's called the collective unconscious. So this is a little bit unusual, but let's accept Freud that the id, the ego, and the superego exist. So let's accept that that exists. Jung wanted to add another layer to that, what he called the collective unconscious. So these two things exist simultaneously. You individually have your own personal unconscious, your own id, your own ego, and your superego. We all have our own three. That's unique to everybody. Well, that is what we would call the personal unconscious. However, above that is this hub called the collective unconscious that everybody on Earth shares on an unconscious level. So again, you don't know you have it, but that we all share sort of this reservoir or hub known as the collective unconscious. And in the collective unconscious are stories and narratives that we might not realize affect how we tell stories and write books and make movies, but at the end of the day, ultimately does, because within the collective unconscious are the frameworks of what are called archetypes. Stories like the Joker or the Jester or the Old Sage or sort of that typical classical hero. So, for example, when you look at literature and you look at movies and you see individuals like Dumbledore in Harry Potter or Gandalf in Lord of the Rings or Yoda in Star Wars, those three individuals all sort of serve similar roles relative to their storylines. Because all three of them are similar in certain aspects, Jung would say the authors or the writers of those books or movies were all influenced on an unconscious level in the collective unconscious, because each of those three characters really all represent the same type of underlying theme, the old sage figure that sort of guides the protagonist through the story. The fact that there are similarities in how we tell stories is a byproduct, according to Jung, of the collective unconscious. I call him Collective Carl. Collective Carl as a mnemonic. There are only a couple individuals in this course who have Carl as a name, so that's why I call him Collective Carl. So you can connect the collective with Carl, collective unconscious. Just to give a little snapshot here of his writing. The contents of the collective unconscious are called archetypes, which means they are original, inherited patterns or forms of thought and experience. They are ancient, unconscious source of much that we think, do, and say as human beings. They are the givens in our psychological makeup, the patterns that shape our perceptions of the world, the furnishings that are present in our psychological home from the moment of birth. We inherit the same forms, but each of us fills it in the content by the way we experience our lives. Thus, the father, for example, might be a positive archetype to one person, might be filled with a negative meaning for another, but that we have these broad-stroking frameworks, and that when storytellers sit down to write stories, they don't realize it, but they already have these archetypes, these broad strokes, these ideas that they've inherited as a result of the collective unconscious, that we, for one reason or another, have this hub of information. One example of this is the psychological concept of the shadow, a character who becomes the side of the personality that they never really wished to be. And you can see this in a bunch of different stories. Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars, for example, would be a great example of this. And when you sit down and write a book, a short story, a movie, a play, whatever it might be, you might not realize it at the time, but there's the possibility that you're pulling information out of your collective unconscious and then building characters that fit those roles, again, on a totally unconscious level. So just to reflect, Adler and Jung, generally speaking, agree with the idea of that personal unconscious, id, superego, and ego. They reject the emphasis on libido, sex drive, and instead offer differing theories and differing ideas as to what might be going on an unconscious level. The inferiority complex, or these archetypes, these collective unconscious archetypes that we all share, that give us sort of these broad strokes within our storytelling.